Good evening and welcome. You may take a slow, comfortable breath and allow the world around you to soften just a little. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to decide. This story moves calmly, steadily, at the pace of ordinary life. Tonight, we are not entering a palace, we are not following an emperor, and we are not searching for legends. Instead, we are stepping quietly into the lives of ordinary people in ancient China, the people who made up almost everything. Most people in ancient China were not remembered by name. They left no statues, no written stories, but without them, nothing else could exist. To understand their lives, we must first let go of a modern idea, the idea that life is something chosen. For most people in ancient China, life was not designed, it was inherited. A child was born into a family, into a village, into a set of expectations that had already existed for generations. Nothing about this was temporary. From the beginning, an ordinary person belonged to a structure, family first, then village, then state. These were not abstract ideas, they were daily realities. A person did not ask who they wanted to become. They learned who they already were. This system was not chaotic, it was highly organized, and it functioned precisely because most people followed it without resistance.
Ordinary people were expected to work, to obey, to endure. Not because they were punished constantly, but because the system left little room to imagine alternatives. Life moved within clear boundaries. Most people were farmers, not by preference, by necessity. Others became craftsmen, laborers, or small traders, often because their families had done the same work before them. Social mobility was rare, change was slow. Stability mattered more than opportunity. An ordinary person's value was not measured by ambition, it was measured by reliability. Could you work when it was time to work? Could you obey when obedience was required? Could you fulfill your role without drawing attention? These were the questions that shaped daily life. From an early age, children absorbed this understanding, not through lessons, through observation. They watched adults rise before dawn. They watched work begin without discussion. They watched elders speak and younger people listen. This pattern repeated itself so consistently that it felt natural. No one explained the system. It did not need explanation. It was simply the way the world functioned. Family was the center of this world, but not in the modern sense of comfort or emotional support. Family was structure. Age determined authority. Gender determined roles. Individual preference mattered very little. Older members of the household made decisions. Younger members followed. This hierarchy was visible every day in where people sat, in who spoke first, in who remained silent. Filial obedience was not a belief discussed in philosophy, it was a behavior practiced constantly. To disobey a parent or elder was not just disrespectful, it threatened the stability of the entire household, and stability was everything. An ordinary person learned early that survival depended on fitting in. Standing out invited trouble. Life was not experienced as a journey toward personal fulfillment. It was experienced as a responsibility to family, to ancestors, to the land. Work filled most waking hours. Even outside the fields, there was always something that needed attention: repairing tools, maintaining storage, assisting others. Rest existed, but it was practical. You rested because your body required it, not because rest was valued for its own sake. At night, exhaustion replaced reflection. There was little time to ask questions like, "Is this the life I want?" Instead, there was a quieter understanding: this is the life that must be lived. The state reinforced this mindset without needing constant presence. Laws existed, punishments were known. But more powerful than fear was predictability. People knew what would happen if they followed the rules. They also knew what would happen if they did not. This knowledge shaped behavior more effectively than force. Ordinary people were not free in the modern sense, but they were not constantly oppressed either. They lived within limits, and those limits defined reality. Change was not expected. A good life was not a better life, it was a stable one where harvest came as usual, where taxes were paid, where the family remained intact. Meaning was not something to be discovered, it was something already assigned. And because of this, life did not feel dramatic. It felt repetitive, predictable. And that predictability brought a form of quiet security. As generations passed, the same patterns repeated. Children grew into adults who repeated the same actions. They raised children who did the same. History, for ordinary people, was not something that happened, it was something that continued. And it is within this continuation, this steady, controlled rhythm, that the everyday life of ancient China truly existed. Not in moments of greatness, but in the quiet endurance of millions of ordinary lives. As we move forward, we will look more closely at the forces that shaped this endurance, starting with the land itself and the agricultural clock that controlled not only work, but time, expectation, and survival. For now, you may simply let this understanding settle, slowly, as the night continues.
Before an ordinary person in ancient China understood law, before they understood family hierarchy, before they understood the state, they understood the land. Not in theory, in the body. The land decided when to wake, when to work, when to rest, and when to worry. For most people, time was not counted in years, it was counted in seasons. The agricultural cycle did not simply support life, it organized it. In northern China, millet dominated the fields. In the south, rice shaped entire regions. Different crops, different climates, but the same dependence. Everything began with preparation. Long before seeds touched soil, fields had to be repaired. Dikes were checked, channels cleared, earth packed down again by hand. This work was heavy and repetitive. It was done before planting, and again after floods, and again whenever water damaged the land. No one questioned whether it was worth the effort. Without it, nothing followed. Floods were not rare disasters, they were expected events.
The Yellow River, in particular, was unpredictable. It could nourish fields or destroy them. Villagers watched water levels closely, not with instruments, with memory. They remembered past years, high floods, low floods. These memories guided decisions more than hope. When planting time arrived, it did not wait for readiness. It arrived when it arrived. Seeds were sown by hand, slowly, carefully. There was no room for experimentation. What worked before was repeated again. Once crops were planted, waiting began. Waiting did not mean rest. Fields required attention, weeds removed, water redirected. But there was also a different kind of waiting. The quiet awareness that much was now out of human control. Rain could come too early, or not at all. Cold could linger. Heat could arrive suddenly. An ordinary farmer did not expect mastery over nature. They expected adjustment. This shaped mentality. People did not imagine perfect outcomes. They imagined acceptable ones. A harvest did not need to be abundant. It needed to be enough. Throughout the growing season, work followed the sun. Mornings began early, not from discipline, but from necessity. Midday heat slowed movement. Bodies rested briefly in shade. Then work resumed. This rhythm repeated day after day with little variation. Time passed quietly. There were no clocks marking hours. The body knew when it was time. As harvest approached, tension increased. Fields were watched closely. Grain was tested by hand. Too early, and yield was weak. Too late, and risk grew. Harvest required coordination. Families worked together. Neighbors assisted one another. There was no celebration during harvest, only concentration. Once grain was gathered, attention shifted again. Storage became critical. Grain was life, food, seed, tax. It had to last. Every step of this cycle was known in advance. Nothing was surprising. And yet, nothing was guaranteed. This uncertainty did not produce rebellion. It produced caution. Ordinary people learned to expect instability and to respond with repetition. They did not dream of escaping the land. They depended on it. Even those who did not farm directly, craftsmen, laborers, clerks, were bound to agricultural timing. Taxes were collected after harvest. Labor obligations followed seasonal gaps. The state itself moved according to the same clock. This is what made the system endure. Nature dictated rhythm. People adapted. The state organized around that adaptation. No single part could break away. For ordinary people, the land was not symbolic. It was immediate. A poor season meant hunger. A failed harvest meant loss. There were no reserves large enough to ignore this reality. And so life remained grounded. Every decision, when to marry, when to repair a house, when to take on extra work, was shaped by agricultural timing. The future was not imagined in abstract terms. It was imagined as the next season. Could this year reach the next?
That was the central question. And because this question repeated every year, life itself became cyclical, not dramatic, not progressive, stable, enduring. As the land moved through its rhythms, so did people. And from this dependence grew a particular kind of society, one that valued order over innovation, continuity over change. In the next part, we move closer, from fields into living spaces, to see how this agricultural world shaped the way people built their homes, organized their villages, and lived side by side within carefully defined boundaries. For now, let the steady rhythm of land and labor settle in your thoughts, slowly, as the cycle continues.
To understand how ordinary people lived in ancient China, it is necessary to step inside their everyday space, not into a private room, not into a personal refuge, but into a shared environment where life unfolded in close proximity to others and where very little was truly private. Most villages were small. They were not designed for growth. They were designed for function. Homes were built from rammed earth, sometimes reinforced with wood. Roofs were tiled or thatched, depending on region and resources. These houses were not meant to impress. They were meant to endure. Walls were thick. Windows were few. Light entered carefully. Inside, space was limited. Rooms served multiple purposes. Eating, working, sleeping, all happened within the same areas. Furniture was minimal. Mats, low platforms, storage jars. Nothing occupied space without reason. Courtyards were central to daily life. They were places of movement rather than rest. Here, food was prepared, tools were repaired, water was carried in and out. Children played here, always within sight of adults. The courtyard was not a retreat. It was a shared stage. Privacy, as a concept, was limited. Voices carried easily through walls. Movement was visible. Silence was rare. People learned early to regulate themselves, not because they were watched constantly, but because they might be watched at any moment. This shaped behavior. Actions were measured. Speech was restrained. Emotion was controlled, not as suppression, but as habit. Villages were arranged with practicality in mind. Paths connected homes directly to fields, to wells, to storage areas. Nothing was decorative. The layout reflected necessity. Homes clustered together. Distance wasted energy. Closeness saved it. Living close also meant shared responsibility. If one household fell behind, others noticed. If something went wrong, it rarely affected only one family. This was not community in the romantic sense. It was interdependence. Noise was part of daily life. Footsteps on packed earth, tools striking wood or stone, low voices carrying through open spaces.
silence existed mainly at night. Even then, the presence of others was felt. Houses were built to face inward, toward the family, not outward toward the world. The outside was functional, the inside was controlled. Storage mattered greatly. Grain jars were placed carefully. Tools had specific locations. Nothing was left randomly. Order inside the home reflected order in the family. The eldest members occupied central positions. Younger members adjusted around them. Sleeping arrangements followed hierarchy. So did seating. So did access to resources. A home was not a neutral space. It expressed authority. Children learned boundaries physically, where they could sit, where they could stand, when they could speak. This was not taught formally. It was learned by repetition. Homes also connected to work. There was no separation between living and labor. Clothing was repaired where it was worn. Food was processed near where it was eaten. Tools rested near where they were used. This integration reduced waste. It also reduced choice. There was little opportunity to escape daily responsibilities. Even rest occurred in shared spaces. Someone was always present. This closeness produced familiarity, but not necessarily intimacy. Relationships were stable, but not expressive. Care was shown through action, not words. A repaired roof, a shared meal, an extra portion given quietly. Villages rarely changed their layout. Houses were repaired rather than replaced. Paths deepened with use. Boundaries remained fixed. Change was slow and often resisted. Stability mattered more than comfort. Outside influences entered the village carefully. Officials, traders, messengers. Their arrival was noticeable. Most people rarely left the village. Life was lived within a small radius. This made the village feel complete. Everything necessary was here: food, work, family, authority. The world beyond existed, but it was distant. And because life was so local, reputation mattered. Everyone knew who fulfilled their role and who did not. Behavior was remembered. This memory regulated conduct as effectively as law. An ordinary person did not need constant supervision. They carried expectation with them. The home, the village, the family, all reinforced the same message. Stay within your place. Do your work. Do not disrupt the order. This environment shaped thinking. People did not imagine life elsewhere. They imagined continuity here. Their sense of self was not internal. It was relational. Who you were depended on where you stood among others. And so, the village was not just a location. It was a framework, a structure that held people in place, physically, socially, mentally. In the next part, we move deeper into that structure. into the heart of the household itself to understand how family hierarchy and filial obligation shaped everyday behavior, decision-making, and the quiet discipline that governed ordinary lives. For now, let this close, ordered space settle in your thoughts, the sense of living always among others, as the rhythm of the village continues.
To understand how ordinary people actually lived in ancient China, it is not enough to look at land or houses. The most powerful structure was closer than that. It was the family, not the modern idea of family as comfort or emotional closeness, but family as hierarchy, as discipline, as order. For an ordinary person, family was not something chosen, it was something entered at birth and never left. From the very beginning, a child learned where they stood, not through explanation, through daily behavior. Age mattered more than personality. Gender mattered more than preference. Position mattered more than feeling. The household was organized vertically. At the top stood the eldest male. Below him, other adult men, then women, then children. This order was visible in small details: who spoke first, who ate first, who decided, who waited. Nothing about this was symbolic. It shaped every interaction. Filial piety was not discussed as philosophy. It was practiced as routine. A younger person did not challenge an elder, not openly, not quietly, not even in tone. Disagreement existed, but it was private and cautious. Obedience was public and expected. To obey was not seen as weakness, it was seen as stability. The family functioned as a unit of survival. Resources were shared, labor was distributed, responsibility was collective. If one member failed, the consequences spread. This is why control within the family was strict, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. A poorly behaving child did not embarrass only themselves, they endangered the household's standing. Reputation mattered deeply. Villages were small, memory was long. What happened inside a household did not stay inside. This awareness shaped behavior from a young age. Children learned to watch before acting, to listen before speaking. Their education began long before any formal teaching. They learned by copying. A son followed his father. A daughter followed her mother. Tasks were learned through repetition. There was little room for exploration. Life paths were narrow. Marriage was not a personal milestone. It was a family decision. Partners were chosen for compatibility between households, not emotional connection. A marriage linked labor, property, and obligation. Love, if it developed, came later or not at all. Women moved into their husband's household. They adapted to new authority, new expectations. Their position was defined carefully. They managed domestic work. They raised children. They obeyed elders. Their influence was indirect, expressed through diligence rather than command. Men carried external responsibility: taxes, labor duties,
representation before officials. But even men were not free. They answered upward, to fathers, to elders, to the state. The family trained people to accept this pattern. Authority flowed downward, responsibility flowed upward. Elders were respected not because they were always wise, but because order required continuity. Their role was to preserve memory, to remember past seasons, past failures, past solutions. This knowledge stabilized the household. Old age was not retirement, it was repositioning. Elders worked less physically, but observed more. Their presence reinforced structure. They reminded younger members that life was long and patience necessary. Punishment within the family was common, but controlled. Correction was swift. Shame was effective. The goal was not cruelty. It was alignment. Children were not encouraged to express individuality. They were encouraged to fit. Praise was subtle. Disapproval was clear. This created disciplined adults. Adults who did not question hierarchy because they had never known life without it. Family rituals reinforced this order. Ancestral respect was practiced at home. Tablets placed carefully, offerings made regularly. These acts were not emotional, they were procedural. They reminded everyone that the household extended backward in time. You were not alone, you were a link. This reduced the importance of the individual. Life was not about self-expression, it was about continuation. Conflicts existed, of course, tension between generations, between siblings, between spouses. But these conflicts were contained. Open rebellion threatened survival, and so compromise happened quietly, within limits. The family was where people learned to endure, to accept restriction, to prioritize stability over desire. This training prepared them for everything else, for village expectations, for state authority, for legal systems. By the time an ordinary person encountered law or official power, they already understood obedience. The family had taught it first. This is why the system worked, not because people were forced constantly, but because they were shaped early. The household was the first institution. It taught people how to live within limits, how to suppress impulses, how to value order over change. And once this mindset was formed, it followed people everywhere, into the fields, into workshops, into markets, into old age. In the next part, we follow an ordinary person through a full day, not as an eventful story, but as a sequence of obligations, pauses, and repetitions. A day that looks unremarkable, but reveals exactly how this system operated, hour by hour, from morning until night. For now, let this structure settle quietly in your thoughts, the feeling of living inside a family that never truly lets go, as the rhythm of ordinary life continues.
A day in the life of an ordinary person in ancient China does not begin with intention. It begins with necessity. There is no alarm, no chosen schedule. The body wakes because the light changes, because work must begin before heat, because everyone else is already moving. Dawn is not peaceful, it is practical. People rise quietly. not because silence is valued, but because talking is unnecessary. Tasks are already known. There is no discussion about who will do what. Roles were decided long ago. Someone prepares food, someone gathers tools, someone checks animals. Children move when told, often before they are fully awake. Breakfast is simple, small portions, enough to begin. Eating is quick, no one lingers. Work waits. Once the sun rises higher, movement spreads outward. People leave homes and courtyards. They move toward fields, workshops, or assigned labor. Walking is steady, unhurried. There is no need to rush. Fields receive most of the village. Hands meet soil again. The same motions, repeated endlessly. Those not working fields are no less occupied. Tools are repaired. Materials are prepared. Women work continuously, grinding grain, cleaning, managing children. This work is not counted separately. It is assumed. As the sun climbs, heat becomes heavier, bodies slow. This is not laziness, it is efficiency. At midday, movement pauses briefly. People seek shade, sit, drink. Rest is not leisure, it is preparation for continuation. No one sleeps deeply, they wait. Then work resumes. Afternoon passes much like morning. Repetition without variation. Time does not feel long, it feels full. There is little room for distraction. The body stays occupied. As light begins to fade, work naturally tapers off. Tasks are completed where possible, others are left for tomorrow. Tools are returned, animals secured. People move back toward the village. Evening food is prepared again. Simple, familiar. Meals are eaten together when possible. Conversation is minimal. Fatigue replaces hunger. Children grow quiet. Elders observe. Darkness arrives early. There is little artificial light. Lamps are used sparingly. Fuel is valuable. As night settles, activity contracts inward. Families gather close. Sleep comes quickly for most, not from boredom, from exhaustion. This day does not feel special. It is not meant to. It repeats again and again. There are small variations, weather, season, occasional visits from officials, but the structure remains. This repetition shapes thinking. Life is not experienced as a series of choices. It is experienced as continuity. Tomorrow will resemble today, and today resembled yesterday. This predictability does not inspire ambition. It inspires endurance. People do not expect change. They expect repetition. And because expectations are met, the system holds. In the next part, we move deeper into one of the most important stabilizers of this routine: food. Not as culture, not as pleasure, but as fuel, scarcity, and control over the body. For now, let this ordinary day settle in your thoughts.
its quiet rhythm, its lack of drama. As night deepens and the cycle continues. Food for ordinary people in ancient China was not an expression of culture. It was an instrument of survival. Meals were not designed to impress, to celebrate, or to vary. They were designed to keep the body working. Most people ate what their region allowed, and little else. In the north, millet shaped daily life. In the south, rice did the same. This difference mattered, but not in the way modern people imagine. It did not create culinary identity, it created routine. Grain arrived in the household in predictable forms, stored, measured, protected. From that grain came most meals. Cooking methods were simple: boiling, steaming, occasionally roasting. Firewood was valuable, fuel was limited. Food was prepared efficiently with minimal waste. Meals were eaten from shared bowls. Portions were modest. No one ate until they were full. They ate until hunger quieted. Vegetables supplemented grain when available: beans, greens, roots. They appeared and disappeared with the seasons. Fish was eaten where rivers allowed it. Meat appeared rarely. Animals were more valuable alive, for labor, for breeding, for sale. Killing one required justification. Food scarcity was not constant famine, it was constant awareness. Households planned carefully. Grain was divided into portions that had to last. There was no assumption of abundance. A good year did not mean excess, it meant relief. Bad years were remembered long after they passed. Children learned this early. They were taught not to waste. Not through lectures, through correction. Spilled grain was noticed. Carelessness was discouraged. Respect for food was practical, not moral. Cooking was continuous labor. Women carried most of this responsibility, but it was rarely acknowledged. Grinding grain took time and strength. Hands moved over stone daily. Cooking fires required attention. Too much heat wasted fuel. Too little ruined food. Meals structured the day. Morning food allowed work to begin. Midday food sustained effort. Evening food prepared the body for rest. Eating was quick. There was no ritual around meals, no conversation encouraged. Food was consumed, then work resumed. Illness changed food preparation slightly. Grain softened, liquids increased. But even then, resources were limited. There was no special diet, only adjustment. Festive meals existed, but they were rare. A slightly larger portion, an additional ingredient. They did not disrupt the pattern. They reminded people what was possible, not what was expected. Food also connected households to the state. Grain was taxed, measured, taken. This meant food was never fully private. What you ate was linked to what you owed. Shortages created anxiety, not protest. People adapted by reducing portions, by mixing grains, by stretching supplies. Hunger was managed quietly. It did not define identity. It defined limits. Children grew accustomed to this rhythm. They learned when food would come and when it would not. They learned patience through hunger. This shaped temperament. Desire was controlled. Expectation was lowered. Eating became functional. And because food was predictable, life remained stable. Not comfortable, but steady. Food did not offer escape. It offered continuation. As long as grain remained, the household endured. When grain failed, everything else collapsed. This understanding sat quietly beneath daily life. It did not need to be spoken. In the next part, we turn from what people consumed to what they wore and used, the clothing and tools that shaped their physical experience of work, weather, and constant wear. For now, let this simple, sustaining rhythm settle, the quiet understanding that food was not joy, but survival, as the night continues and the cycle holds. For ordinary people in ancient China, material life was defined by one rule above all others. Nothing existed to impress. Everything existed to last. Clothing, tools, household objects, all were judged by use, not appearance. Most people wore garments made from hemp or coarse silk. The fabric was rough, durable, breathable enough for long days of labor. Clothes were simple in shape, straight cuts, loose layers. They were designed to move with the body, to bend, to carry weight, to endure repetition. There was no concept of fashion for ordinary people. Color was limited, decoration rare. What mattered was whether clothing could survive work. Garments were worn year after year. When they tore, they were mended. When they thinned, they were patched. Repair was constant. A piece of clothing did not belong to a moment. It belonged to a lifespan. Seasonal change meant adjustment, not replacement. Layers were added or removed. Worn fabric was reused. Nothing was discarded easily. Children often wore altered versions of adult clothing. As they grew, garments were let out, reshaped, repaired again. This taught a lesson early. Things were not personal expressions. They were shared resources. Tools followed the same logic. A tool was expected to work for years, sometimes decades. Wooden handles were smoothed by. For ordinary people in ancient China, material life was defined by one rule above all others. Nothing existed to impress. Everything existed to last. Clothing, tools, household objects, all were judged by use, not appearance. Most people wore garments made from hemp or coarse silk. The fabric was rough, durable, breathable enough for long days of labor. Clothes were simple in shape, straight cuts, loose layers. They were designed to move with the body, to bend, to carry weight, to endure repetition. There was no concept of fashion for ordinary people. Color was limited, decoration rare. What mattered was whether clothing could survive work. Garments were worn year after year. When they tore, they were mended. When they thinned, they were patched. Repair was constant. A piece of clothing did not belong to a moment. It belonged to a lifespan. Seasonal change meant adjustment, not replacement. Layers were added or removed. Worn fabric was reused. Nothing was discarded easily. Children often wore altered versions of adult clothing. As they grew, garments were let out, reshaped, repaired again. This taught a lesson early. Things were not personal expressions, they were shared resources. Tools followed the same logic. A tool was expected to work for years, sometimes decades. Wooden handles were smoothed by repeated use. Metal edges were sharpened carefully. A broken tool was not thrown away. It was examined, repaired, adjusted. Only when repair was impossible was replacement considered. This repair culture shaped thinking. People did not expect convenience, they expected maintenance. Daily life included constant checking. Is the handle secure? Is the blade dull? Is the rope weakening? This attention prevented sudden failure. Tools were not owned casually. They represented labor, effort, time. Losing one was serious. Household objects followed the same pattern. Bowls, mats, baskets, storage jars, all were functional. Cracks were sealed. Breaks were tied or reinforced. Perfect condition was not expected. Use was visible. Wear was accepted. This created an environment where nothing looked new, but everything worked. Material reality also reinforced social limits. Fine silk existed, but it belonged to elites. Ordinary people knew where the boundary was. Clothing communicated position without words. To wear beyond one's station was not only impractical, it was dangerous. Sumptuary rules limited excess, but more powerful than law was habit. People did not imagine wearing what they were not meant to wear. Tools, too, reflected hierarchy. Specialized tools belonged to state workshops. Ordinary households used what they could manage. Technology advanced slowly. Innovation was cautious. A proven method was safer than a new one. Failure risked survival. This material restraint shaped daily sensation. Clothing rubbed against skin constantly. Rough fabric reminded the body of work. Tools carried weight. Hands felt resistance. The physical world was not soft. Comfort was minimal, but familiarity made it tolerable. The body adapted. Calluses formed. Posture adjusted. Movements became efficient. People learned how much energy to spend. Material life trained discipline. You did not overuse a tool. You did not waste fabric. You did not demand replacement. You worked within limits. Children learned this by watching adults care for objects. Nothing was used carelessly. Even small items had value. This attitude extended beyond things. People treated effort the same way. Energy was spent deliberately, not emotionally, not impulsively. This is why ambition rarely showed itself. Material reality taught restraint. There was little space for desire to grow unchecked. When everything required effort to maintain, excess felt burdensome. Enough was enough. In this environment, life did not feel deprived, it felt contained. Expectations matched reality. Ordinary people did not imagine a world of abundance. They imagined a world that continued. Clothing that lasted another season. Tools that survived another year. This was success. And because material life demanded constant care, work did not end when farming paused. When fields rested, hands turned to repair. This leads naturally to the next layer of ordinary life, work beyond agriculture, the repetitive labor of craftsmen, laborers, and state workers, whose days were shaped not by land alone, but by quotas, orders, and physical endurance. For now, let this sense of material restraint settle, the feeling of a world where nothing is wasted, nothing is decorative, and everything serves its purpose, as the quiet rhythm of ordinary life continues.
Even though agriculture defined the rhythm of the year, not everyone in ancient China worked the fields every day. But this did not mean freedom from labor. Work, in one form or another, filled nearly all waking life. Beyond farming, there existed a wide range of necessary tasks: crafts, construction, transport, repair, and state-directed labor. These forms of work were not alternatives to agriculture. They were extensions of it. Most craftsmen were not independent specialists. They were farmers first, workers second. During seasons when the fields demanded less attention, hands turned toward other duties. Pottery was shaped, tools were repaired, wood was cut and prepared. This work did not bring status, it brought usefulness. A craftsman was valued not for creativity, but for reliability. Could you produce the same object the same way again and again? Consistency mattered more than innovation. Many skilled workers were drawn into state workshops. Here, labor followed quotas. Objects were made to specification: weapons, tools, building materials. The pace was steady, the supervision constant. Workdays were long, tasks were repetitive. There was no sense of personal ownership over what was produced. The product belonged to the state. The labor belonged to obligation. For ordinary people, this was not a career choice. It was an assignment. Adult men were especially vulnerable to this form of labor. At certain times of year, they could be called away from home for weeks or months. Roads needed repair. Canals required digging. Walls needed reinforcement. This labor was known as corvée. It was mandatory. Refusal was not an option. Families adjusted to these absences quietly. Fields were managed with fewer hands. Women and elders took on additional work. No one expected compensation beyond survival. The work itself was exhausting: digging earth, carrying stone, moving timber. These tasks wore down the body quickly.
Injuries were common. Recovery was uncertain. But the work continued. State labor was not designed to be humane. It was designed to be effective. Yet even outside state projects, ordinary labor followed similar patterns. Builders constructed homes and storage facilities. Smiths repaired metal tools. Weavers produced fabric for local use. Each task repeated endlessly. There was little variation from day to day. This repetition shaped mental endurance. People learned not to measure work by satisfaction. They measured it by completion. The idea of fulfillment did not apply. You worked because work was required. Markets depended on this labor. Craft goods moved from hands to stalls, not in abundance, but in sufficiency. Most exchanges were local, personal. Large-scale trade existed, but it touched ordinary lives only lightly. The majority of work remained invisible beyond the village. Physical strain was accepted as normal. Bodies aged quickly. Hands hardened. Backs bent. This was not seen as tragedy. It was expected. Children observed this early. They saw adults work through discomfort. They learned that pain did not stop obligation. Rest existed only to enable further work. This attitude reinforced social stability. People did not imagine a future without labor. They imagined a future where labor continued. Work beyond farming also reinforced hierarchy. Those who supervised labor stood above those who performed it. Orders moved downward. Compliance moved upward. Questioning slowed production. Silence preserved it. This dynamic did not encourage resistance. It encouraged adaptation. People learned how to endure long tasks without complaint. They learned how to pace themselves. This skill mattered. Those who could not endure fell behind. Those who endured quietly survived. Work defined reputation. A person known for diligence was trusted. A person known for avoidance was remembered. Memory traveled faster than law. This informal pressure kept labor consistent. In this way, work beyond farming was not a separate category of life. It was part of the same system, a system that demanded effort, rewarded compliance, and discouraged deviation. Whether in fields, workshops, or construction sites, ordinary people lived inside labor, not as a phase, not as a means to something else, but as a condition of existence. In the next part, we turn to one of the most powerful forces shaping this condition: law. Not law as justice, but law as discipline. A system designed not to protect ordinary people, but to regulate them. For now, let the weight of this labor settle quietly, the understanding that work was not chosen, only endured, as the steady rhythm of ordinary life continues. For ordinary people in ancient China, law was not a distant idea. It was not something discussed only in courts or texts. It was present, known, and quietly feared. Law did not exist to protect individuals. It existed to preserve order. From an early age, people understood this without needing explanation. Rules were clear. Consequences were visible. Punishment was not hidden. It was meant to be seen. This visibility shaped behavior more effectively than force. An ordinary person did not need to read legal codes to understand them. They learned through observation. They heard stories. They saw examples. They remembered outcomes. Law was designed to prevent disruption, not to resolve conflict gently. If something threatened stability, it was corrected quickly and publicly. One of the most powerful features of this system was collective responsibility. Individuals were rarely treated as fully separate. Families were held accountable for their members. Villages were held accountable for their households. If one person committed an offense, others could suffer alongside them. This created constant internal pressure. People monitored one another, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Silence, caution, and conformity were safer than risk. Fear was not constant panic. It was background awareness, a steady understanding of limits. Most ordinary people never encountered law directly, and that was the goal. A good life was one that avoided attention. The ideal citizen was invisible. Laws were strict, but enforcement was selective. Officials did not patrol constantly. They intervened when order was disturbed. This unpredictability made law more effective. You never knew exactly when authority would appear, so behavior adjusted preemptively. Punishments were harsh by modern standards. Beatings, forced labor, exile. These were not meant to reform. They were meant to deter. Mercy was not central to the system. Consistency was. The message was simple: do not disrupt. Ordinary disputes were usually handled within families or villages. Law entered only when these structures failed. This reinforced the importance of internal discipline. Families corrected their own members to avoid external involvement. Shame was powerful. Public embarrassment could damage not just one person, but an entire household. Reputation mattered deeply. Once damaged, it was difficult to restore. People learned to measure their actions carefully. Speech was controlled. Anger was restrained. Not because emotions did not exist, but because expression carried risk. The legal system also reinforced hierarchy. Those higher in status had more protection. Those lower had less. This was understood. An ordinary person did not expect fairness. They expected order. Fairness was not the promise of the law. Predictability was. This predictability shaped thinking. People did not ask whether rules were just. They asked whether they were known. Knowing the rule was safety. Ignorance offered no protection. Children absorbed this atmosphere naturally. They were warned early. not with abstract lessons, but with examples. Do not do this. Look what happened. Fear was educational, but it was not paralyzing. It was practical. People learned how to live within boundaries. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned how to avoid conflict, how to settle disputes quietly, how to endure small injustices to prevent larger ones. Law also reinforced loyalty to the state. The state did not need constant presence because people carried its expectations within themselves. This internalization was crucial. It reduced resistance. It increased compliance. Ordinary people did not think of themselves as resisting or obeying. They thought of themselves as surviving. The law was part of the environment, like weather or soil conditions. You adjusted to it. You did not fight it. And because law was tied to punishment rather than protection, people relied more on family and village than on authority. This strengthened local control. Villages became self-regulating units. Order was maintained not through constant enforcement, but through shared fear of consequences. This fear was not emotional drama. It was quiet calculation. Is this worth the risk? Most of the time, the answer was no. And so, life remained steady, not because people felt safe, but because they felt constrained. This constraint did not crush daily life, it shaped it. People learned to live narrowly, carefully. This made large-scale rebellion rare and small-scale compliance common. The law did not need to be loved, it only needed to be understood. And it was. In the next part, we will see how this same system of control extended into one of the most constant obligations in an ordinary person's life, taxes and forced labor, not as occasional demands, but as regular reminders that the state was always present, always counting, always expecting. For now, let this quiet presence of law settle in your thoughts, the feeling of living carefully within known limits, as the rhythm of ordinary life continues.
For ordinary people in ancient China, the state was not an abstract power. It did not exist only in distant capitals or official texts. It arrived regularly, predictably, and without asking. Taxes and labor obligations were the most direct ways people experienced the state. Not once in a lifetime, every year. Grain taxes came first. After harvest, officials appeared to measure. They did not ask how the year had been. They measured what existed. Grain was counted carefully. Amounts were recorded. Portions were removed. This was not negotiation. It was procedure. For households, this moment carried quiet tension, not fear of punishment, but fear of shortage. What remained after tax determined survival. People planned for this long in advance. They knew roughly what would be taken. They adjusted consumption accordingly. Taxation shaped eating habits, storage decisions, and long-term planning.
grain did not fully belong to the household. It was always partially claimed. This understanding was constant. Beyond grain came labor. Corvée labor was mandatory for adult men. At certain times, names were called. Assignments were given. Roads needed maintenance. Canals needed clearing. Walls needed building. The work was heavy, unpaid, and unavoidable. Refusal was not an option. Men left their villages for weeks or months, sometimes longer. Families adjusted silently. Fields were worked with fewer hands. Children took on more responsibility. Women carried heavier burdens. No one protested openly. There was no expectation of fairness. Labor was not a punishment. It was a duty. The state did not apologize for taking time or strength. It assumed the right. This assumption shaped how people viewed authority. The state was not benevolent. It was necessary. It maintained order, controlled floods, built infrastructure. But it demanded payment. This relationship was transactional, not emotional. People did not love the state. They endured it. Officials were respected but not trusted. Their arrival brought disruption, measurement, inspection. Households prepared carefully. Records mattered. Compliance mattered. Errors could bring attention. Attention brought risk. So people learned to be exact, to give what was required, no more, no less. Labor obligations reinforced this discipline. Work sites were strict. Supervision was constant. Tasks were repetitive, physically demanding. Injuries were common. Rest was limited. The work did not adapt to the worker. The worker adapted to the work. When labor ended, men returned home changed, tired, older. But the village absorbed this quietly. There was no celebration, no reward. Life resumed. Children watched this pattern closely. They learned that adulthood meant obligation, not independence. Taxes and labor were not temporary burdens. They were structural. They connected every household to the state every year. This prevented separation. No village could forget its place. The state did not need constant presence. Its demands were enough. Through taxes and labor, the state shaped behavior, planning, and expectation. Ordinary people learned to live within this reality. They did not imagine escape. They imagined endurance. And because these demands were predictable, life remained stable. Not easy, but structured. In the next part, we move away from obligation and look at one of the few spaces where ordinary people interacted voluntarily: local markets, places of exchange, movement, and limited choice, where trade existed, but freedom did not. For now, let this steady pressure settle in your thoughts. The sense of a state that never disappears, never relaxes, but remains quietly present, as the rhythm of ordinary life continues. For most ordinary people in ancient China, the market was one of the few places where choice appeared to exist. But even here, freedom was limited. Markets were local. They operated on fixed days, often once every few days, sometimes less. People did not wander in casually. They arrived with purpose. Goods were simple: grain, vegetables, cloth, tools, small household items. Nothing excessive, nothing decorative. Most exchanges were modest, often between people who already knew each other. Barter was common. Coinage existed, but it was not abundant. Money passed hands carefully. It was saved, counted, protected. For many households, coins were used only when necessary. Taxes, occasional purchases, unexpected needs. Daily life did not revolve around money, it revolved around resources. Markets were regulated spaces. Officials monitored activity. Weights and measures were checked. Prices were observed. This was not to protect consumers, it was to prevent disruption. Trade was tolerated because it was useful, not because it was admired.
Merchants occupied an uneasy position. They provided necessary goods. They connected regions. They moved items people could not produce themselves. And yet they were distrusted. They did not produce food. They did not build infrastructure. They profited from movement. This conflicted with the values of stability and rootedness. Ordinary people interacted with merchants cautiously. Purchases were brief, negotiation limited. No one lingered longer than necessary. Travel related to trade was restricted. Most people never traveled far from home. Movement required permission, documents. Roads were watched. Posts existed. This limited opportunity. A person's world remained small. Markets did not expand horizons. They reinforced locality. People bought what they needed, then returned home. There was no culture of browsing, no leisure consumption. Even market days followed strict rhythms: morning activity, midday slowdown, closing by evening. Nothing extended into the night. This predictability maintained order. Markets also served as information points. News traveled here, quietly, briefly. People listened carefully, spoke cautiously. Rumors were dangerous. Words could carry consequences beyond the market. So conversations stayed shallow. Exchange without exposure was ideal. Children accompanied adults to markets. They observed behavior. They learned restraint. They saw how adults interacted without drawing attention. Markets were not places of expression. They were places of necessity. Even joy was restrained. A successful exchange did not invite celebration. It invited relief. What was needed had been obtained, and that was enough. For ordinary people, the market did not represent opportunity. It represented balance between shortage and sufficiency, between isolation and connection. Trade existed, but freedom did not expand with it. Life remained contained. The market closed. People returned to fields and homes. Movement ended where it began. In the next part, we turn to one of the rare paths through which some ordinary people attempted to change their position: education and literacy, not as enlightenment, but as a narrow opening within a largely fixed system. For now, let the quiet rhythm of the market settle in your thoughts, the brief movement, the careful exchange, the quick return to familiar ground, as the cycle of ordinary life continues.
Education existed in ancient China, but for ordinary people, it was not a promise. It was an exception. Most children did not expect to learn to read. They expected to work. From an early age, usefulness mattered more than instruction. Hands were trained before minds. Learning happened through observation, through repetition, through correction. Formal education required time, and time was a resource few families could spare. Literacy was respected, but it was not common. To read and write meant stepping slightly outside the ordinary rhythm of life. That step carried risk. A child who studied did not work in the fields. They did not carry water. They did not assist constantly. This absence had to be justified. Only families with a small surplus could afford it. Even then, success was uncertain. Village education was basic: a local teacher, simple texts, characters practiced again and again. There were no guarantees. Learning was slow, progress uneven. Children memorized before they understood. Repetition mattered more than curiosity. Education was not meant to create thinkers. It was meant to create function.
Those who learned to read could keep records, calculate, follow written instructions. This had value, but it did not dissolve social boundaries. A literate person was still bound by family, by village, by obligation. Education did not erase hierarchy. It merely shifted position slightly within it. For most ordinary people, education ended early, a few years at most. Work reclaimed the day. Books were rare. Paper was valuable. Writing was careful, purposeful. No one wrote for pleasure. The idea of learning as self-discovery did not exist here. Knowledge served order. Even those who advanced through education did so cautiously. They remained tied to expectation. Failure was costly. Years spent learning could end with nothing gained, and the family would bear that loss. This uncertainty kept ambition in check. Education was not a dream shared widely. It was a narrow path walked by few. Those who walked it did not leave the system behind. They became part of its machinery: clerks, record keepers, minor officials, useful but not free. For the majority, literacy remained distant. They relied on others to read documents, to explain notices, to handle written authority. This reinforced dependence. Words held power. Those who could read held a quiet advantage, but even they lived within limits. Education did not protect from taxes.
It did not remove labor obligations. It did not erase fear of law. It simply added responsibility. And so, most ordinary people remained where they were, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the system did not reward movement. Stability was safer than ambition. Parents taught children what they knew would keep them alive, not what might elevate them. This decision was practical. A working child was certain, an educated one was uncertain. In this way, education reinforced the system rather than challenged it. Knowledge circulated, but it did not disrupt. The structure held. And alongside education, another quiet force shaped daily behavior, belief and ritual, not as emotional faith, but as maintenance, a way to keep life in balance and order intact. In the next part, we turn to that quiet presence, the daily rituals that accompanied ordinary people without promising change, only continuity. For now, let this narrow opening of education settle in your thoughts, the sense of possibility constrained by reality, as the rhythm of ordinary life continues.
For ordinary people in ancient China, belief was not a separate part of life. It did not stand apart from work, family, or obligation. It was woven into them. Religion was not approached as mystery or escape. It was approached as maintenance, a way to keep balance, a way to avoid disruption. Most belief was practiced at home. There were no grand pilgrimages for ordinary people, no dramatic ceremonies meant to transform the soul. Instead, there were small, repeated actions, ancestral tablets placed carefully on shelves, offerings set out at regular times, bows performed without emotion. These actions were not spontaneous. They followed routine. The purpose was not to feel something. The purpose was to acknowledge continuity. Ancestors were not distant spirits. They were part of the household. They represented past authority, past labor, past survival. By honoring ancestors, people reaffirmed the structure they lived inside. You were not acting alone. You were part of a line. This belief reinforced obedience. If ancestors watched, then behavior mattered even when no one else did.
Rituals did not ask for miracles. They asked for stability. Good harvests, healthy children, protection from disorder. No one expected dramatic intervention. Belief did not challenge reality. It explained it. When illness arrived, people responded practically first. Rest, herbs, care. Ritual followed quietly. A small offering, a brief bow. Religion supported action. It did not replace it. This approach shaped emotional life. People did not expect belief to solve problems. They expected it to maintain order while they endured. There was no contradiction between belief and hardship. Hardship was part of the cycle. Rituals were repeated not because they always worked, but because they had always been done. Change was dangerous. Consistency was safe. Seasonal rituals marked transitions: planting, harvest, new year. These moments were acknowledged, but not celebrated extravagantly. They reminded people where they were in the cycle. Local temples existed, but they were secondary. Most religious life remained within the household. Temples were visited cautiously, often only when necessary. Religion did not create community excitement. It reinforced existing hierarchy. Elders led rituals, younger members followed. Children learned belief the same way they learned obedience, by copying. They learned when to bow, when to remain silent, when to place offerings. No one explained why in detail. Explanation was unnecessary. The ritual itself carried meaning. Belief also helped people accept limits. If life was difficult, it was not questioned. It was interpreted. This prevented unrest. People did not seek new systems of meaning. They reinforced the old ones. Religion in this context did not inspire hope of transformation. It inspired patience. It told people that endurance was correct, that continuity was valuable, that disruption invited chaos. And so belief became another stabilizing force, quiet, predictable, undramatic. It did not interrupt daily life. It followed it. At night, belief receded even further. There were no long prayers, no nighttime rituals. People slept. The gods did not need constant attention. The order had already been acknowledged. In this way, belief functioned much like law and family, as a structure that guided behavior without constant enforcement. It reminded people that life was larger than the individual, but not in a liberating way, in a containing one. As days continued, belief faded back into habit, invisible, assumed, and alongside belief, another quiet reality remained ever present: vulnerability, illness, injury, loss, not as exceptions, but as expected elements of ordinary life. In the next part, we turn to that vulnerability, to the ways ordinary people lived with sickness, death, and the constant awareness that life was fragile and rarely long. For now, let this quiet, procedural belief settle in your thoughts, the feeling of a world maintained through repetition, not faith in change, as the rhythm of ordinary life continues.
For ordinary people in ancient China, vulnerability was not a surprise. It was expected. Illness did not interrupt life suddenly. It arrived quietly, often without clear cause, and it stayed as long as it wished. People did not ask why sickness came. They asked how long it would last. Medical knowledge existed, but it was limited. Herbs were gathered, roots were boiled, simple remedies were applied with care. Treatment focused on balance, warmth, rest, moderation. There was no certainty. Recovery was hoped for, but never assumed.
Injury was common. Work demanded physical effort every day. Tools slipped. Loads were heavy. Bodies were tired. A strained back, a cut hand, a broken limb. These were not unusual events. They were part of working life. Healing took time, and time was costly. When someone could not work, others compensated quietly. Children took on more tasks. Elders supervised what they could. There was no system to replace lost labor. The household absorbed the loss. Sick illness changed routines. Food was softened. Liquids increased. The sick person rested closer to warmth. Care was practical, not sentimental. There was concern, but also acceptance. Not everyone recovered. Death was present in daily awareness. Life expectancy was low by modern standards. People did not expect long lives. Children died. Adults died. Elders died. This was not shocking. Grief existed, but it did not halt life. When someone died, the household adjusted. Simple rituals followed. The body was prepared. The family gathered. There was no prolonged ceremony. Work resumed quickly. Not because loss was insignificant, but because survival required continuation. Death reinforced hierarchy. Elders were respected not only for wisdom, but because they had survived. Age itself was achievement. Children learned early that life was fragile. They were not sheltered from this knowledge. They witnessed illness. They witnessed loss. This shaped temperament. People did not expect protection. They expected endurance. Medical practitioners existed, but they were few. Most care happened at home. Serious illness could ruin a household. Resources were diverted. Labor was lost. Debt increased. This vulnerability kept expectations low. People did not imagine future prosperity. They imagined survival. Death did not bring closure. It brought reorganization. Roles shifted. Responsibilities moved. Life continued around absence. This acceptance did not come from emotional detachment. It came from familiarity. Illness and death were part of the cycle. Like drought or flood, they could not be avoided, only endured. Belief offered explanation, but not prevention. Rituals acknowledged loss, then released it. There was no promise of reunion, only continuity of the household line. This perspective shaped behavior. People avoided unnecessary risk. They conserved strength. They accepted limits. Ambition seemed dangerous. Stability seemed wise. In this environment, life was lived carefully, not fearfully, but cautiously. People did not rush toward experience. They maintained balance. This made the system resilient. Loss did not break it. It reshaped it. And so, even in vulnerability, life continued. As illness passed, as households adjusted, as memories settled, the cycle moved forward. In the final part, we step back from individual moments to see the larger picture, why this way of life endured for centuries, and how repetition itself became the quiet strength of ordinary people in ancient China. For now, let this awareness of fragility settle softly, the understanding that life continued, not because it was safe, but because it adapted, as the rhythm of ordinary life carries on.